When Hitler unveiled his newly created Luftwaffe in 1935, the world was impressed. Here was a modern air force which looked ready to rival those of Britain and France in both quality and quantity. By the outbreak of the war in 1939, the Luftwaffe appeared to be the most powerful in the world. Its performance during the invasion of Poland that September seemed to confirm this impression. Under the surface, however, the German Air Force was fatally flawed. The Luftwaffe failed to establish the right priorities for new types of aircraft and increasingly lacked the production resources to produce sufficient quantities of planes. The High Command suffered from internal rifts and disorganization. It dissipated its strength on ground combat roles. These and other blunders would eventually lead it and Germany to defeat. Forbidden an air force by the Treaty of Versailles, which formally ended World War I, Germany had secretly put in place the framework for the Luftwaffe before Hitler came to power in 1933. Under the Nazis, the pace of its growth quickened dramatically and demonstrated that Germany had finally thrown off the shackles of Versailles. By 1935, the air forces of the leading democracies of the world had operated under restricted budgets for many years and had few modern aircraft. In contrast, the Luftwaffe started with a clean sheet and was allocated large sums of money. Consequently, from the outset, its aircraft were modern, making it a formidable force. The Luftwaffe was given an additional advantage when the Spanish Civil War broke out in July 1936. Hitler immediately sent Juncker's Ju-52 transports to take the troops of leading Spanish insurgent General Francisco Franco from Spanish Morocco across the Mediterranean to Spain. Hitler then formed the Condor Legion, whose fighter and bomber crews, in conjunction with aircraft sent by Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, gained modern combat experience. The Russians also sent aircraft and crews to assist the forces of the left-wing Spanish government. This enabled German pilots to duel with aircraft like the Polikarpov I-16. In this way, the Luftwaffe was able to prove its aircraft and their crews in battle. It seemed a finely honed instrument by the outbreak of World War II. Yet, from the outset, the higher organization of the Luftwaffe was fatally flawed. Hermann Göring was its titular chief, as well as Hitler's leading toady. Besides never wishing to give his Führer bad news, he was often indolent and meddlesome. Below Göring came Erhard Milch, the Secretary of State for Air. He dealt with all matters except operations, and was also the Luftwaffe's Inspector General. Milch, who had earlier been responsible for the setting up of Germany's national airline Lufthansa, was a good organizer, but very ambitious. Hans Jesenek, the Luftwaffe's Chief of Staff, had a brilliant mind, but was a loner. He was responsible for operations, intelligence, signals, logistics, training, and organization, but only had direct access to Göring on operational matters. Jesenek had no direct control over personnel. They were dealt with by Göring's office. Aircraft supply and procurement also lay outside Jesenek's control. Matters were not helped by the fact that Milch and Jesenek did not personally get along. World War I fighter ace Ernst Udet was responsible for aircraft procurement and was directly answerable to Milch. Udet was a glamorous figure who had been a film star in the 1920s, but was temperamentally ill-suited for his post. Like so much in the Nazi system of government, divide and rule reigned. It was a recipe for disaster. When Hitler set up the Luftwaffe, he initially saw it as a means of threatening his neighbors and forcing them to bow to his demands. Mass flybys at the annual Nuremberg rally ensured that this message got across. If Hitler should be forced into war, the Luftwaffe's primary role would then be to support ground operations. To this end, the Army and the Air Force spent much time perfecting the techniques of air-ground cooperation. This policy caused the Luftwaffe to concentrate primarily on dive bombing at the expense of developing a fleet of heavy bombers. It was to prove a grave error. Ernst Udet had purchased 2 Curtiss Hawk dive bombers from the United States. These planes inspired the development of the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka. The Stuka was highly effective during the early Blitzkrieg campaigns. But its slow speed in level flight made it vulnerable. It was withdrawn from service in autumn of 1943. Goering and his senior Luftwaffe officers demanded that other bombers be given a dive bombing capability. Notable among these was the highly promising Junkers Ju-88. But once the necessary strengthening of the wings and fuselage had been carried out, the weight of the aircraft had almost doubled, significantly reducing its performance. None of this mattered very much during the early Blitzkrieg campaigns, in which the Luftwaffe performed impressively. This was both in attacking ground targets and destroying hostile aircraft. But it was when Hitler turned against Britain that the Luftwaffe's shortcomings began to be apparent. Not only was dive bombing unproductive, but the Luftwaffe blundered by grossly underestimating its opponent. At the end of May 1940, during the German invasion of the West, Goering declared that his Air Force would destroy the British Expeditionary Force in the Dunkirk pocket. The RAF fighters and the Royal Navy ensured that this did not happen, and that the British Expeditionary Forces were able to make good its escape back to Britain. When Goering sent the Luftwaffe to pave the way for a German invasion of Britain in the late summer of 1940, he badly miscalculated the RAF's remaining combat power. The result was that the Luftwaffe suffered its first defeat, and the invasion of Britain never took place. It was in Russia, however, that the German Air Force's weaknesses, especially its growing inability to meet the demands made on it, really began to be revealed. The Luftwaffe began the campaign in spectacular enough fashion. It destroyed well over 1,000 aircraft on the first day of the invasion alone. But as the German panzers plunged ever deeper into Russia, the Luftwaffe found it increasingly difficult to meet the Army's wide-ranging demands for support. These calls on the Luftwaffe required more aircraft than it possessed, and production could not meet demand. The underlying cause for this was Hitler's refusal to put the German economy, especially the munitions industry, on a proper war footing until 1943. The German aircraft industry, therefore, lacked the resources to produce the ever-increasing numbers of aircraft needed by the Luftwaffe. The Army and Navy also had heavy demands on Germany's industrial base. Goering, however, increasingly blamed Udet for the production shortcomings. This made Ernst Udet so depressed that he committed suicide in November 1941. Goering ordered his suicide to be hushed up. It was officially announced that he had been killed testing a new secret weapon, but it was Goering's blatant mismanagement that caused Udet's death. Goering, like others in the Nazi hierarchy, wanted a finger in every pie. The result was that Luftwaffe resources were diverted into areas away from the air war. It was perhaps logical that Germany's parachute arm should be under Luftwaffe control. But Goering went one step further and created Luftwaffe field divisions and even a Panzer Grenadier division which bore his own name. These formations, however, fought under the Army, as did his paratroops. So too did much of the anti-aircraft or flak arm, which was also part of the Luftwaffe. By the spring of 1943, these ground combat elements accounted for over 10% of the Luftwaffe's strength. They did nothing for its effectiveness in the air. Goering also refused to allow the German Navy any control over maritime air power. He failed to recognize the importance of air power in the war at sea. Consequently, the German Navy often felt let down because promised air support did not appear and its relations with the Luftwaffe were poor. But one of the Luftwaffe's most serious shortcomings was the lack of a long-range heavy bomber. It had nothing with which to strike at the rapidly growing Soviet war industry. This shortfall was the result of blunders by the Luftwaffe High Command. In the mid-1930s, development work began on what the Germans called the Ural bomber, a four-engine heavy bomber designed to strike at Russia. However, Erhard Milch ordered all work on the project to cease, ruling that all bombers must be two-engine types because more of them could be built. The Heinkel Company, however, continued to believe in heavy bombers and developed the HE-177 with two sets of engines in tandem to circumvent Milch's policy. But there were continual problems with these because of their tendency to overheat. Also, the Luftwaffe's dive-bombing fixation meant that the HE-177 had to have this capability. Consequently, the HE-77's entry into service was excessively delayed, and the Germans had nothing with which to strike at the Russian munitions industry until it was too late. After the surrender at Stalingrad in early 1943, the Germans were steadily driven back, putting the Soviet munitions industry out of range, even to the HE-177. By the spring of 1943, the tide had clearly turned against the Luftwaffe, especially with British and U.S. heavy bombers increasingly appearing in the skies over the Third Reich. They starkly brought home to the Germans their own lack of a heavy bomber. Both Goering and Hitler blamed Jesenek for the Air Force's shortcomings, so much so that, like Udet, he eventually committed suicide in November 1943. Yet the Luftwaffe could have tipped the balance and fought off the Allied bombers if it had deployed a new type of aircraft in time. In August 1939, on the very eve of the war, the world's first jet aircraft, the Heinkel HE-178, made a successful maiden flight. It was followed by the two-engine HE-280, which first flew in April 1941. One month later, the first Allied jet, the British Gloster Whittle, made its maiden flight. Messerschmitt, too, had entered the jet age with its Me-262. In 1943, the Luftwaffe, which had been slow to take the jet seriously, eventually chose this aircraft to go into production. Hitler now stepped in, insisting that it should be configured as a fighter-bomber rather than pure fighter. This delayed the start of production. In addition, the Nazi hierarchy was unwilling to commit sufficient fighter production capacity to jets. All this meant that the Me-262, which could outfly the fastest Allied fighter by nearly 100 miles per hour, did not enter service until the summer of 1944. By this time, the Allies were firmly ashore in Normandy, and the opportunity for the Luftwaffe to turn the tables on its enemies had been missed. Even though the German jets enjoyed success against the Allied bombers, they were never built in sufficient quantities to affect the course of the war in the air. As the impact of the Allied bombing on Germany increased, Goering placed the blame on his fighter arm, accusing its pilots of cowardice. Eventually, he sacked Adolf Galland, its youthful and inspirational leader. He finished the war commanding a special Me-262 squadron, manned with fellow senior and distinguished fighter pilots. A significant part of the German fighter problem was that, unlike in the Allied air forces, the German pilots flew on without rest until they were shot down. Thus, the number of veterans declined ever more sharply. Furthermore, aircrew training had been suffering since 1942. The main training aircraft was the Luftwaffe's workhorse, the Junkers Ju-52. As early as 1939, it had been deemed obsolete as a transport aircraft, but no replacement was procured. The losses of Ju-52s, especially during the airborne attack on the Mediterranean island of Crete in May 1941 and at Stalingrad, meant that more and more were taken from the training organization. But there was no significant increase in Ju-52 production, and aircrew training suffered. In 1944, the Allies launched an air offensive against German oil. Serious fuel shortages resulted. Flying training was ever more restricted, and aircrew quality suffered further. By the last months of the war, a fatalism was engulfing the Luftwaffe. This was encapsulated in Operation Bodenplatte, a mass attack on Allied airfields in the Low Countries and northeastern France, which was mounted on the 1st of January, 1945. No less than 300 German aircraft were lost, as well as 214 pilots, including many squadron, wing, and group commanders. Their experience could not be replaced. Yet, the Luftwaffe fought on until the bitter end. But such was the desperate state to which it had been reduced that in the last days it was incapable of mounting more than 50 sorties per day. When the final German surrender came, the Luftwaffe's airfields were littered with aircraft of every type, many of them wrecked. They were a bitter testament to the numerous blunders under which the Luftwaffe had operated for nearly 6 years of war.